There is a generation that nobody fully understands. Not even themselves. They are not the boomers, the optimistic, institution-trusting post-war generation who believed the system worked and played by its rules. They are not the millennials, raised on participation trophies and the promise that they were special. They are not Gen Z, digital natives who never knew a world without the internet. They are the ones in between, born between 1965 and 1980, raised in the gap. Formed by a world that was falling apart in slow motion and never really bothered to explain why. They are Generation X. And the psychology that formed in them, the specific, durable, often misunderstood way they think and feel and relate to the world, is unlike any other generation in modern history. Not because they are better, not because they are worse, but because of what happened to them during the years when a person's psychology is most deeply shaped. Today we are going to go inside that psychology, the science behind it, the history that created it, and the traits that define it, including the ones Gen X themselves have never quite found the words for. Part 1. The world that built them. To understand Gen X psychology, you have to understand the environment they were formed in. Because psychology is not built in a vacuum, it is built in response to specific conditions. And the conditions of Gen X's childhood and adolescence were objectively destabilizing. The 1970s were not a stable decade. The Vietnam War had fractured public trust in government. Watergate had confirmed that the people in charge were capable of profound dishonesty. The oil crisis had created economic panic. Inflation was eroding the financial security that the previous generation had built. And divorce, once rare and stigmatized, was suddenly everywhere. By the time Gen X children were in elementary school, the divorce rate in America had nearly doubled from the previous generation. These were not children watching a stable world. They were children watching the structures that were supposed to protect them quietly dissolve. Then came the 1980s, the era of excess and anxiety, AIDS, the crack epidemic, nuclear dread, and a media landscape that handed children the news unfiltered, unmediated through cable television that was suddenly in every home. Gen X was the first generation to grow up in front of 24-hour news. The first to see the world's problems delivered directly into the living room with no adult buffer and no clear explanation of what any of it meant. And through all of it, many of them came home to empty houses. The latchkey generation, children who let themselves in with the key around their necks, made their own snacks, managed their own afternoons, and figured out what to do when something went wrong. Not because their parents were negligent, because the economy required two working parents. Because the culture had not yet built the infrastructure of after-school care and structured supervision that came later. Gen X raised itself, and that experience left a psychology that is precise, specific, and still running. Part 2. What the research shows. Let's get specific about what the science and data actually tells us about Generation X. The first major trait is what psychologists call internal locus of control, the belief that outcomes in your life are primarily the result of your own actions rather than luck, other people, or external circumstances. Gen X scores higher on internal locus of control than any other living generation. Not because they were born this way, because they had to develop it. When you come home to an empty house at 8 years old and something goes wrong, you cannot wait for a parent to appear. You figure it out, you fix it, you handle it. And after enough repetitions of that experience, something settles into the architecture of how you approach the world. I am responsible for what happens to me. Nobody is coming to solve this. I will solve it. This produces extraordinary practical resilience. It also produces, in many Gen X individuals, a deep difficulty asking for help, a topic we will return to. The second trait is institutional skepticism. Gen X watched institution after institution fail, lie, or disappoint during their formative years. Government, church, corporate America, the news media. Each of these structures, which the previous generation had built their lives around trusting, revealed itself to Gen X as fallible at best and corrupt at worst. The result is a generation that trusts individuals rather than institutions, that evaluates the specific person in front of them rather than the organization that person represents. That brings a default skepticism to authority claims that, depending on context, can look like cynicism or like the most rational response available. The third trait, documented consistently across generational research, is adaptability. Gen X entered adulthood in an analog world and adapted completely to a digital one. They did not grow up with the internet, they watched it arrive, learned to use it, and integrated it into their lives without treating it as either utopian or catastrophic. This placed them in a unique position, the only generation that fully understands both worlds. The last people alive who remember what life was like before, and the first to fully function in what came after. Part 3, the emotional architecture. Here is the part of Gen X psychology that is least discussed and most important. The emotional profile that formed in Gen X is not the result of weakness or coldness. It is the result of a specific emotional education, or more precisely, a specific emotional non-education. Gen X grew up in an era before emotional intelligence was a concept anyone took seriously. Their parents' stoic, practical post-war in their orientation did not discuss feelings openly. The cultural message, absorbed through 1,000 small interactions, was consistent. Emotions are private, weakness is dangerous, and getting on with it is the appropriate response to difficulty. And so Gen X learned to get on with it. They became extraordinarily good at functional performance under emotional duress. At showing up, delivering, handling things, while carrying significant internal weight that they rarely disclose to anyone. Research on emotional suppression shows that this pattern has costs. People who consistently suppress emotional expression show higher rates of stress-related physical illness. They report lower relationship satisfaction over time. And they frequently describe a sense of exhaustion that they cannot fully explain, a tiredness that sleep does not resolve. Because it is not physical tiredness, it is the tiredness of carrying things alone for a very long time. Gen X did not choose this pattern, they were formed by it. And many of them are only now in their 40s and 50s beginning to understand what it cost. Part 4, what Gen X got right. Let's be clear about something that the cultural narrative almost never acknowledges. Generation X built the world you're living in right now. The companies that run the modern economy, Amazon, Google, YouTube, Tesla, LinkedIn, Twitter, were founded and built primarily by Gen X. Not by boomers, who largely built the institutions of the previous era. Not by millennials, whose entrepreneurial peak is still ahead. By the generation that had been told it was forgettable, Jeff Bezos, Gen X. Elon Musk, Gen X. Sergey Brin and Larry Page, Gen X. The founders of YouTube, Gen X. These are not people who were handed opportunity and ran with it. They built opportunity from scratch during economic uncertainty. Without the generational wealth their parents accumulated, and without the digital fluency their children were born into. They figured it out because that is what they learned to do. Beyond technology, Gen X reshaped culture. They created grunge and hip-hop's golden era. They produced independent cinema. They developed a form of cultural commentary, smart, ironic, deeply aware of contradiction, that became the template for everything that followed. And then, quietly, they handed the cultural microphone to the next generation and went back to work. Without making it about them, which is perhaps the most Gen X thing of all. Part 5. The thing nobody asks them here is what the research on generational well-being consistently shows, and what almost nobody talks about. Gen X is the most financially stressed, most time-squeezed, and most emotionally unsupported adult cohort in America right now. They are the sandwich generation in the most complete sense. Many are simultaneously raising children and caring for aging parents, carrying the weight of two generations while managing careers that are more precarious than the ones their parents had. In an economy that has punished them twice with major recessions. They entered the workforce during the early 1990s recession. They built financial stability. The 2008 financial crisis partially erased it. They rebuilt again. Now they face retirement in an era where retirement itself has become significantly less certain. And through all of it, they do not complain, not loudly, not publicly. Not in the way that generates cultural sympathy or institutional support. Because complaining is not how they were built, and so the culture assumes they are fine. Their children assume they are fine, their aging parents assume they are fine. They are handling it, which to everyone around them looks indistinguishable from being fine. But handling it and being fine are not the same thing. And the generation that raised itself on empty houses and quiet endurance deserves to have someone finally say that out loud.